Falsifying the Past. This is number 6 of the series Mistakes We Make in Thinking, and I'm Robert M Ellis. Our memories and records of the past are often unclear enough, because memory is not so much like a recording instrument that records everything perfectly, but more like a path that we have to keep using and wearing away in order to keep it clear, to keep the undergrowth away. So there are enough problems in maintaining our understanding of the past, but cognitive biases that interfere with our understanding of the past add another element, add an interference that prevents us from addressing the conditions from the past. That interference consists of present beliefs, the present dictating the past for us. Not that the memories and records from the past completely disappear, but they filtered in and through present beliefs. The first and most obvious way of falsifying the past is the falsification of history. We can see a clear example of this in this pair of pictures. In the left-hand picture, Stalin's surrounded by 3 of his close followers, but the one standing on his left is removed in the right-hand picture. He fell out of political favour, of course, which meant that Stalin had his picture removed, as though he'd never been there on the occasion which was photographed. A procedure that required more technical interference than could easily be done today with Photoshop. This, of course, is an example from history, from documented history, from interference in documents. We can do the same thing within our own minds. We can remove elements from our memories that no longer fit our assumptions from the present, or indeed we can insert things that didn't happen originally that again fit our assumptions in the present dictating to the past. Another way of distorting history is survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is the tendency to judge the past only on the basis of what has survived to the present. Have a look at this family tree, the simplified family tree, of course, but the 2 figures at the bottom, if we take them to be the ones that survive to this day, are much more likely to judge their past family in terms of their own line of succession, the people that they remember or that their nearest relatives remember. So they may remember their grandmother, they may have photos of her. Their grandmother in turn may remember her father, great-grandfather, and her grandfather, great-great-grandfather. So the past is represented for these modern people by those past figures, not by the alternative line of descent that died out. The great-grandfather's sister is no longer remembered, or hardly so. A special effort is required to recollect the cousins of grandmother, that are hardly considered now because they had no descendants. A similar kind of problem applies if you think about the succession of books or the succession of novelists that survive to the present from the past. So if we were asked to judge the success of 19th century novelists, for example, we would probably pick out the ones that survive, the ones perhaps that are still published today or still accessible today. We don't consider the ones that never made it, or perhaps to start with the ones that published but were lost and no longer read very much. We certainly don't consider the ones that weren't published at all, let alone the ones that never even finished their books, yet they were 19th century writers as well, and perhaps they had important things to say which never reached the light of day, which could tell us a great deal about that time. The news illusion particularly affects and distorts our understanding of the recent past. After all, if you read a newspaper, what the newspaper will predominantly tell you about is what happened yesterday. You'll judge what happened yesterday according to what's in the newspaper, not all the other things that happened yesterday that aren't in the newspaper because they weren't considered important enough to be included, or perhaps were excluded for political or other prejudicial reasons. Of course, if you then think about the further past, one of our important sources for what is considered important in the further past will be what was then considered important enough to include in the records concerned, whether those were newspapers or other kinds of records. Even our view of further history is subject to the prejudices of what people thought was news at the time. Hindsight bias is the tendency to think that past events were inevitable from the standpoint of the present. After all, we know what happened. We know that Hitler lost the Second World War. We know that Napoleon got driven back from Moscow and so on, but the people involved in those events didn't know what was going to happen, and it's very difficult for us now to put ourselves back in their position, understanding the uncertainty that they experienced at that time. When President Nixon of the US visited China in 1972, there was a great deal of uncertainty about how successful his mission would be. As it turned out, it opened a new era of diplomatic relations between the US and China. But it might very well have turned out not to be such a success. A famous psychology experiment about hindsight bias began by asking people before Nixon's visit to rate the probability of success of the visit. Those ratings were then recorded in relation to the people who made the ratings of probabilities. A few years later, the experimenters then went back and asked the same people to rate what they thought the probabilities were at that time. Of course, almost without exception, those people greatly overrated the probabilities that Nixon would be successful. Their ratings were very much higher. They considered the probabilities of success very much higher than they had before those events took place. So, how can we avoid falsification of the past? And I'm thinking here to start with of the remoter past, of what we generally call history, rather than what happened in the last few minutes, for example. Well, one good way to start is obviously simply to study history. The more you know about history, the more you've considered perhaps a wide variety of history, sampling different times and cultures, the more you'll know about the context of past events, the easier it will be to judge. To start with, how much uncertainty there were for people in that time, so as to avoid hindsight bias. We're also more likely, if we know the context, to understand all the numbers of projects that started off but failed, so as to avoid survivorship bias. We'll also be aware of the kinds of ways that history can be falsified. Another important way of avoiding falsification of the past is to seek out a variety of sources and perspectives when we're finding out about the past. Obviously, those with one particular perspective, whether that's a political perspective or a national perspective, religious perspective, whatever it is, will tell you one side of the story. But you need to consider those who have quite divergent views from other perspectives. It's a truism that history is written by the victors. That's why it's important perhaps to seek out, quite deliberately seek out, the repressed voices from the past and seek to understand them if we want a more objective view of what has occurred. So, for example, the voices of women from the past were very often not given the same kind of prominence to a very great extent than the voices of men. So it's worth seeking out those forgotten or half-forgotten voices of women. Another example will be in the history of colonialism, who predominantly tells the history of the colonization of Africa by Europeans. Well, overwhelmingly, for Europeans at least, it's European historians and storytellers. But there's also the voices of, for example, But it's not just a question of getting information from a variety of sources or information from repressed voices. It's also a question of using our imagination to reconstruct what it may have been like in the past, particularly when we're trying to avoid survivorship bias or hindsight bias. That's where the historical novels, reconstructions, imaginative reconstructions of the past, or indeed historical films, can come into their own. So this kind of artistic construction of the past can actually help us to be more objective about the past, even though historians may complain about their degree of accuracy. In other ways, they help us to be more accurate because they give us an imaginative relationship to the context to help us avoid common cognitive biases in relation to it. Now we're going to look at more recent biases in personal memory. To start with, have a very quick look over this list of random words. Now, what do you remember from that list? See if you can note it down very quickly. Well, you can see for yourself, but probably what you remembered will have been of particular kinds. One of the kinds of things you were likely to remember are things that are particularly salient for you, perhaps due to your purposes or interests or stories that you're familiar with. Say, for example, if you happen to have an interest in quantum physics, maybe that leapt out at you from the list and you remembered it. Or if you happen to live in Albany, which is a place in New York State in the US, then perhaps you remembered that. Another thing that you're quite likely to remember, though, is the first thing on the list. So, in testing with this list, people quite often, though not always, tend to remember the first item on it. That's the first thing they come across. So, in terms of psychological biases, this is known as the primacy effect. So we tend to remember the first thing that we come across in relation to a particular object or person. That's why, of course, they always say that first impressions count for a lot in an interview. We tend to judge people by their handshake or whether they look us in the eye or this kind of thing when we first meet them. Alternatively, or in addition, you may have remembered the last thing on the list, assuming that you read the whole way down the list. Or alternatively, you may remember the last thing that you read as far as you got down the list. So perhaps you remembered diverticulitis because that's the last thing on the list or the most recent thing you read. Another bias that can affect our short-term memories is known as the Zeigarnik Effect, after Bluma Zeigarnik, a Russian psychologist who worked in the 1920s. Apparently, the origin of the Zeigarnik Effect came from when Zeigarnik herself visited a restaurant and was particularly impressed by the memory skills of a waiter who could remember people's orders in his head, very complex, lengthy lists of orders. Then he'd go off and he'd bring them all back and he'd be completely accurate in giving the right orders to the right people and so on. But then it turned out that Bluma Zeigarnik left her scarf behind in the restaurant. She only discovered this after she'd gone away for a few minutes. So she returned to the restaurant, found the waiter, and asked him, could you get my scarf? I left it at the table I was sitting on. And the waiter said, which table were you sitting on? I don't remember you. And Zeigarnik was very surprised by this, but she said, you had such a phenomenal memory. You remembered every single item in great detail from the orders. How come you don't remember which table I was sitting at? And the waiter said, well, as soon as I've finished a particular order, as soon as the customer's gone, I dismiss that from my mind. I don't think about them anymore. I focus on the next customer. And that's the Zeigarnik Effect. So once we have an incomplete task, we focus on it. If, on the other hand, the task is completed, then we dismiss it from our minds and are much less likely to remember it. Avoiding these kinds of limitations in our memory of the near past is probably much harder than avoiding the falsification of history in the longer term. Of course, we can try to be aware of it, and we can try and compensate for the primacy effect, the recency effect, and the Zeigarnik effect. We could try and memorize or make a particular note of completed tasks. We could try and pay more attention to the second and third things in lists rather than just the first and the last. But very often we don't know which are likely to be the most important ones in advance. So it's only with the benefit of hindsight that it occurs to us that the things we're less likely to focus on might be important. So if we're not to deceive ourselves, we need to recognise how difficult it may be to avoid these kinds of limitations in memory of the nearer past. Probably the best way of addressing them is more generally just through mindfulness. So practices such as meditation, for example, can increase our awareness of memories or experience at all times, rather than focusing too narrowly on one particular event. One of the tests that Zen masters were traditionally supposed to ask their prospective new pupils was to ask them to notice details or try to recall details that they hadn't known in advance would be important, like where exactly they left their shoes outside the door, or how exactly they opened the door, or what colour it was if they weren't familiar with it. Little details like those. It's when we remember those that there's some indication that we're more mindful. That's when we'll start also remembering the second and third things on the list, rather than just the first and the last. That was video number 6 in the series Mistakes We Make in Thinking by Robert M Ellis. Understanding, recognising and responding to the mistakes we make in thinking is part of the wider practice of objectivity training. Objectivity training combines cognitive psychology, critical thinking and practical philosophy to help people make more adequate judgments. Please see robertmellis.net/objectivity training to find out more about objectivity training, how it works, and to find potentially a course where you can learn objectivity training in more detail. Also, for a community devoted to working with the mistakes we make in thinking, please see Middle Way Society.